I'm Beccy Speight. I'm the Chief Exec of RSPB, and it's great to be here with this panel. I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion. So the question we're looking at today is, does nature hold the key to rebuilding the environmental consensus? That's the question we're going to talk about. And I think it's really interesting because whenever you see polls of what people think around nature, climate, etc., then across the political divides, there is this broad support for protection and restoration of nature at quite a high level, actually, usually around about 74, 75%, something like that. And so the question we have to ask is, does that mean, as we kind of, look at rebuilding this consensus, we should be putting nature more and more centre stage in terms of how we rebuild that consensus and how we talk about the environment more broadly. So I'm really interested in and I'm going to be asking the panel, why does nature resonate in this way? And can it be used as this kind of gateway drug to fixing net zero for all of us? Question. The UK is absolutely a nation of nature lovers. So we do an event at RSPB called Big Garden Birdwatch. Some of you probably take part. Thank you very much. That has between 500,000 and 1 million people just counting the birds that they can see in their kind of local green space once a year. So, we are absolutely a nation of nature lovers. Climate change is a huge driver of nature loss. So, the latest State of Nature report produced a few years ago basically showed that the two biggest drivers of nature loss on land are climate change and also, intensification of agriculture over the past 50 years or so. If you go out to sea, it's slightly different. Development is a big driver, unsustainable fishing is a big driver. But climate change is definitely looming large. We've got a bit of polling coming out fairly soon from the RSPB that looks particularly at that lens in terms of house building, which won't surprise you. But today we're going to kind of really, I think about how nature and climate change relate to each other and how they relate for people as well, and kind of what that tells us about where we should be going in terms of rebuilding this consensus. So I'm going to turn first of all and ask Tony, first of all, who I'm sure needs no introduction, but just in case. He's chair of Natural England, which is obviously the government body in terms of nature advice. He's just published a new book, I will get that plug in for you, called Just Earth, which is very, very good. He's a fellow of the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. He's chair of Cool Earth, and he's a trustee of Fauna and Flora International. So, Tony, my question to you is, I guess the one, actually it's the title of another book you wrote, which was what I was reading under my cottonwood tree in the national park in the States when I thought, I think I need to do a bit more about nature, which was what has nature ever done for us? Why does it matter? And what is the connection between nature and climate action in your view?
Thank you, Becky. Good afternoon, everyone. So the climate and nature connection is fundamental and profound. In our minds, we tend to silo things out and divide them up to make sense of them. You've mentioned already climate change being a major driver of nature decline, which it now is. Looking the other direction, the destruction of nature is a major driver of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. And on top of those two dimensions, the decline of nature is making us more vulnerable to the effects of global heating in terms of flooding, extreme heat, and the extent to which coasts are protected or not by natural vegetation. All of those things we know pretty well. So those sets of connections are quite strong and clear, and you would hope that as we witness the effects of climate change now, never mind talking about pathways to reducing emissions, we are in the era of consequences, and one would hope that the rebuilding of the health of nature as a climate change adaptation strategy, and a relatively cheap one compared with some other options, would be something now that we could strongly make the case for, thereby rebuilding a consensus around how nature provides dividends for society. And you were kind enough to mention what has nature ever done for us, which was an attempt, and this is now 12 years ago, that book, an attempt to set out the many ways in which healthy nature contributes to economic development, growth and well-being. And that was based upon an observation that I had had for many years, whereby the main schism in the consensus about nature was not whether it was beautiful or not, or whether we should protect it. It was about the economic rationality of having regulations that protect nature at a time when we're trying to achieve other goals, house building, economic infrastructure, whatever it would be, and nature being held there as a barrier to that kind of development. And I thought, well, what we need to do is to lay out the evidence which shows that nature is the fundamental underpinning system that enables growth in the economy, or indeed any economy to exist at all. Now, it was very interesting writing that, because I discovered there wasn't a consensus about that. And guess who were the people who disagreed with that economic analysis? It was the environmentalists. It was the people who were campaigning for environmental protection, who objected to the idea of attaching economic values to nature on the grounds that it detracted from the intrinsic and moral arguments that they were making, which I think is a really interesting thing to interrogate as we're looking for consensus, because the question of consensus about what is really important. Consensus about economic values, consensus about the extent to which we can adapt to climate change, consensus about the beauty of nature, consensus about spiritual values, consensus about ethical or moral dimensions, all of which are all in play at once. And when people are disagreeing, they're not necessarily disagreeing about nature or the need to protect it. Sometimes they're disagreeing about the rationale and the reasons why we're investing so much time in it. But I think at the current moment, and looking at what's going on in this country and elsewhere, the principal pushback against ambition for nature recovery, I think, is an economic rationale. It's getting in the way of growth and development. Therefore, we need to favour growth and development ahead of nature. And I don't think that framing is correct, but it's in play. And actually, again, I think rebuilding the arguments and the consensus around nature being underpinning for economic development and health and well-being, and indeed national security, I think that's where we might wish to place our emphasis as we go forward.
Great. Okay, thank you very much for that. And I think I've heard you say recently on a platform, and indeed I've said the same thing, that in 10 years' time, all we're going to be talking about is adaptation. And I think that's just a really interesting area to explore later on. I'm going to move on now to my Olivia Blake MP impersonator. So unfortunately, Olivia can't be with us. There was a vote she had to be in the House for. But it's very good to have you with us, Lydia. Now, Lydia is actually the head of natural environment at Green Alliance, and she has got a PhD in conservation science, so I should be calling you Dr. Lydia Cullis. And she's also worked in the area of food and farming for the last 3.5 years. So I'm going to ask her particularly around the area of agriculture, actually, and farming, and the role of farming in this, because two things, have struck me recently. One was I was with a friend last weekend who is an upland farmer up in Teesdale, who said to me, "We're not making any money this year. We are having to live off our savings, and how sustainable is that going to be?" So and I think it's fair to say that, the farming sector as a whole is pretty peed off at the moment. And I'm just interested in that, because, and part of the reason I'm interested is we've seen in Europe, that the kind of the power of that, farming sector to break apart actually the kind of consensus we're talking about today. So I just wondered if you would give us a few thoughts on that.
Yeah, so thank you very much for having me, and sorry that I'm not Olivia Blake.
Perfect.
So I think it's right to talk about farming and agriculture here in this nature panel, because I think it does hold so much potential for nature restoration. There's a lot of conversation about planning at the moment, and that's drawing a lot of attention, and of course that does have potential to have major impacts on nature. But farming does cover much more land than development ever will, and so what happens through farming policy is really, really key to nature restoration. I think it's interesting the point that you made about what's happening in Europe and what's happening in the UK in terms of farming policies. In England, following Brexit, we've had complete redesign of the way that the farming budget is spent, which was kicked off by the Conservative government and has been continued under the Labour government. And so we're now in a position where area-based subsidies are being replaced by payments for public goods. And that means that England has got a more ambitious policy than Europe does on that front. And it is a really big deal. There's been a lot of bumps along the road, and you've said that there is a lot of uncertainty and a lot of unhappiness, and there's a lot still to work out. But farmers generally have been behind that transition. They didn't oppose the phase out of the area-based subsidies, because for some farmers, they can see that this is a route to a more sustainable income in places of the country where it is difficult to make a profit from producing food alone, and it has been for a long time. So the potential to access funding for creating some woodland on a bit of the land, or restoring some of the peatland and having maybe a smaller grazing herd on another bit of the farm, and lots of those farms are doing those range of activities already. It's just about changing the proportions that they're doing them in a bit, and there is a more viable and sustainable income for some of them in doing that. I think we're hitting a time now where the schemes that are replacing the area-based subsidies they really need to accelerate in terms of how quickly things are coming out and the certainty. And so the next couple of years is going to be a really key time. But I do think it is an ambitious place to be, and we shouldn't lose sight of how significant this journey that is currently going on is, and is for nature as well.
Yeah. I mean, I worry about us losing momentum on that journey, and that, there's been talk of, while there was this kind of wait for what was happening around kind of countryside stewardship, that, margins were being ploughed up, hedgerows cut out, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that there is a real risk around momentum, and certainly some of the work we've done has shown that, the level of ambition around how many farmers were trying to get into those higher tier nature schemes to kind of do stuff for nature, do stuff for climate, is much higher than the current ambition inside government. So I think there's a real risk around that. So it would be good to talk about that again later on. I'm going to come now to Baroness Coffey, who again will not need a huge amount of introduction to people. She's the former Conservative MP for Suffolk Coastal, former Deputy PM, and former Secretary of State for DEFRA, but also Health and Social Care Work and Pensions. She's been on the Environmental Audit Committee, and it's been in the House of Lords from January, start of this year. So the question I wanted to ask you, Thérèse, is really around climate change and its evidence as being one of the biggest drivers of nature loss, as I said earlier on. And the question mark has to be now, so do the Conservatives really care about nature if they say they would repeal the Climate Change Act, because the two seem intrinsically linked, to my mind?
Thanks, Becky. I also spent 3 years at DEFRA before then as well, so I was 4 years in DEFRA in total, or just over. So yes, I think the Conservatives absolutely do. And actually in Kemi's announcement, she stressed about the importance of nature and the environment, but is fed up with aspects of the climate change and the net zero, and aspects of the country are not ready in terms of some of the measures, I think, to be done under carbon budgets at the pace at which the carbon budgets were demanding some of these things to be done. So the country is not ready to switch off gas. The country is not ready to switch off a whole variety of things. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't still be doing it, and I think we will continue as Conservatives to support a reduction in emissions. But I'm not shying away from this bold statement. I must admit it took me a bit of time to understand Kemi's announcement on how we interplay in that regard. But One of the things, though, and I remember the IPBES report being presented to, I can't remember if it's the G7 or the G20, and climate change is one of the 5 main factors, but it's not actually the most important factor. The most important factor is still habitat. It's about organisms in terms of overfishing, not having enough food for flora and fauna. It's invasive species, and I've forgotten the other one, in addition to climate change, forgive me. So there's an element here about what we need to do to try and get on and deliver what are the building blocks for nature. And for me, my focus, a lot of my time in office was about habitat. And one of the things that's frustrating is the lack of delivery on getting stuff done. And one of the things, and Tony, it's nothing personal, but one of my frustrations coming back into the department was how stuff had just got behind. Now, we had Brexit, get that. We had COVID, understand that. But still a frustration that we're not planting trees quickly enough. We're not getting through different assessments quickly enough. And those things are absolutely vital, because we know if we provide habitat, if we continue our reduction of pesticides and other things that affect the natural environment, then we can actually make a massive difference and hit that primary target set out in the 2021 Environment Act. So a lot of things have got delayed, which was frustrating, but also just taking time to do. So it just so happens this morning I was at a meeting about the Northern Forest. You and I were together. Becky and I planted the first tree in the Northern Forest all those years ago. And yet, speaking to the Woodland Trust, they are frustrated at how long it is taking to get consent from organisations like Natural England to get on with tree planting at scale. So these are the things that we need to unlock, in my view. It's great to see Pippa Railings here, MP for one of the Cambridgeshire seats, South Cambridgeshire, I think, who's also an officer of the all-party group for local nature recovery strategies. And again, that for me is one of the building blocks that we need to get working on. Frustrating that they are also way behind time. So big plans in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. I voted against a lot of what the government wants to do because I didn't think it was actually right for nature. But nevertheless, we've got to get on with delivery and sometimes be prepared to take a bit more risk in order to get the reward.
Okay, so that's kind of getting into the area of
the momentum.
Regulation and deregulation around this agenda as well, which might be interesting to explore. Mya-Rose, I'm going to come to you. Mya-Rose, for those of you who don't know her yet, is a leading British Bangladeshi birder. So she's a proper birder. And she's also an environmentalist and an anti-racism activist. And she started a great movement called Black to Nature, which is all about getting young people in particularly out into the countryside, and particularly young people who are a visible ethnic minority source from their background, and giving them the chance to kind of really connect with nature and experience. It's something that's often very new to them. And I know Mya-Rose is kind enough to be an ambassador for the RSPB, but for lots of other organisations in our sector as well. So Mya, I wanted to ask you, how can nature really deliver for those marginalised communities, and could that connection do more in your view?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like to an extent we all understand just how important nature is to us on every single level. The thing that's brought up very often is obviously mental and physical health. Sorry, I've written down lots of numbers so I don't forget. If there was more green access, apparently the NHS would be able to save £2.1 billion, which is a lot of money. But this is particularly important in terms of minority ethnic and low-income children in particular, actually. And it's been shown that 60 minutes outside every day reduces the chances of mental illness by 50%, which is massive, especially because these are groups that are particularly affected by mental illness, especially severe mental illness. And so there's this very practical, physical benefit that's very tangible. But I think on top of that, there is this deep emotional connection. And I think actually when you dig further into why so many young people in particular are really struggling, is because that connection to nature has been severed, which I feel like sometimes can sound like a slightly vague, hippie-ish thing, but on...
It's all a bit woo-woo.
Yeah, but kind of on a deep fundamental level, we are animals, and I think that's why, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this more, even people who don't really think of themselves as environmentalists or people who care about climate change or the environment, they still feel that very deep connection to nature, and I think that's why across the political spectrum, people say they care about nature and the future of the planet and the future of nature and the future of biodiversity. And I think that's why, and I do think that's something that we can leverage more. And in terms of my kind of more grassroots experience, every single child that I have taken out into nature has fallen in love with nature, which is why I do think that there is something inherent, including, you know, it can be very stroppy teenagers who are like, I don't want to be here. And they have an incredible time. And so I think part of it as well, in terms of engaging people with the wider environmental movement, is just increasing the volume of nature we have. I think there's kind of this weird contrast between, I'd say a lot of people within the general public think of the UK as somewhere that's very green and has a lot of nature, when actually we're one of the worst countries in the world. We have just over 50% left. And so I think also just increasing access to nature by having more nature is going to be one of the really key things going forward.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I think I loved your increasing the volume, you know, just increasing the amount that's available to people feels really, really important right now. I think I was struck, in the panel before this one, we touched on kind of community, you know, ownership and community connection to energy generation. And I had an amazing experience, actually, when I was working for the Woodland Trust, where I went to the Isle of Lewis up in Scotland, and there was a completely community-owned wind farm that was then generating profits for the community, who were putting it into tree planting, actually, and spending some of it on tree planting. And that was just a really interesting connection. And I'm just interested from the conversation we've had so far, just, you know, around, you know, the importance of nature and adaptation, the importance for nature in kind of really connecting people to their own kind of health and well-being and improving that. And then, you know, also this kind of issue about, you know, farming being this key kind of, you know, means of, you know, doing more for nature and climate change simultaneously. And your point, Thérèse, about, you know, kind of delivery and kind of deregulation. I mean, it does strike me that I think nature is a thing that connects people to their immediate place and to their own kind of health and well-being, and, you know, getting on and delivering stuff, you know, the kind of the farming that's going on in 70% of the UK and is therefore all around us. And it does that, I think, far more easily than, you know, talking about emissions or talking about kind of, you know, driving kind of, you know, national grid improvements, you know, through the countryside. So I just wondered if anyone had any thoughts about that point around adaptation in particular. I'm really interested in, and how, you know, nature could be the thing that unlocks that for people so that they kind of get it and see that interrelationship.
So there's multiple reasons why we might wish to restore nature, and the case varies in place to place. Some of the things we've touched on already, so public health and well-being, the ability to be able to reduce flood risk and to reduce heat island effect, plus also on top of that, sustaining agriculture through there being pollinators available, and also to attract inward investment in some parts of the country where there's insufficient good quality green space. People will be inclined to build more houses if there's a nice environment for the people to enjoy. So there's multiple reasons why we might wish to invest more in nature recovery, but the case varies from place to place, I think, Beccy, but the climate piece is becoming so prominent and so obvious now that it may be a new front line through which to encourage people to see the case for nature recovery, especially in towns and cities where, you know, 40 degrees centigrade we had in 2022. In a decade's time, that might be a normal summer temperature, and it's going to be absolutely devastating. It really does have serious social and health consequences by having more vegetation, more natural, more structured, more varied structured vegetation in town centres, we know makes a huge difference to that. And if you design that green infrastructure in the right way, it can also help to reduce the effect of some of the peak rainfall events we're going to have. So this may become a new framing narrative for why we're putting so much effort into rebuilding nature around urban areas in particular. It's not quite there yet, and I'm not sure we've kind of created the level of understanding or support for that idea, and we're still coming with a mix of reasons why we want to repair nature, and they're all very good, but still I think we're still building the case for climate change adaptation to being front and centre of all of that. Whatever we do, however, and it goes back to Therese's point, this next point, about the mindset that we approach these challenges with, because we have spent the last 70 years doing conservation, which is trying to hang on to the last little bits of habitat, remnant populations of rare species, and we've tended to do that through regulations, and so habitats, regulations, assessments, sites of special scientific interest, species protection laws, and those things, they can be bureaucratic, they can be quite onerous, and they are about stopping things. If we wish to adapt to climate change in a dynamic and innovative way, the agenda is less about conservation and more about nature recovery. And nature recovery is a different thing because it's not going to be done principally through regulation. It's going to be done through making a multi-benefit case, involving many partners and bringing investment to make things happen rather than trying to create a legal line to stop things happening. And so it is quite different. And I don't think we're quite there yet. But as we embrace the adaptation agenda and we think about our targets for the country in terms of how we're going to achieve recovery and not just conservation, we will need to look at some of those regulatory codes. And government is getting involved with some of that now via the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. And it's not a particularly comfortable place for many environmentalists, having spent the last 7 decades making the case for all of those regulations. But if we're going to do this different job, we're going to need a different toolkit. And it's not quite designed yet, I think it's fair to say. But I think we can begin to see it. It's emerging.
Yeah. So you and Thérèse are kind of robustly agreeing there around kind of we need to do something about speeding up delivery, nature restoration. Regulation isn't necessarily helping that.
No, delivery of what becomes an important question.
Yeah.
So is it delivery of conservation goals or is it delivery of recovery for multiple different purposes, including climate change adaptation? And these are 2 very different jobs.
Yeah.
So delivery of conservation goals, number of SSSIs in good condition, that's great, we can do that, but it's not the same as recovery at scale.
No, I mean, I hear that, but my views on the Planning and Infrastructure Bill are known, I think, which is that it's
mine are not, and they must remain unknown.
It's a guddle. It's a guddle, and that's being kind. And I think certainly kind of some of the kind of amendments that still remain and to be kind of fought over as we go through, we'll be finishing the Lords now, back into the Commons, are not going to get us into a good place in terms of being able to kind of pursue that agenda as well. So I think, if Olivia had been here, we would have been talking also about that rhetoric that comes out of government at the moment around, nature being the blocker. Bats, newts, snails. It's always bats, newts and snails, isn't it? Being the
jumping spiders.
Yeah. So that's not helpful, I think, in terms of trying to kind of again create this consensus, which is going to be so important going forward. I'm going to turn to audience, particularly the 2 chaps who were sitting behind me earlier on and said, "I don't know much about this nature stuff, do you?" Now is your chance to ask your questions. So I'm going to come first of all over here in the middle. And then there's somebody up at the back, right at the back as well, and somebody keeping you fit down here at the front. So let's take those 3.
Nigel Haig again from the IEEP. Let me say that I entirely support the statement on the screen, is nature the key, with one qualification, and to remove the and replace it with a. Is nature a key? I entirely agree with the argument that we've heard from the panel that nature connects you to place, which therefore makes climate change, which is too abstract for most people and too remote. It's a planetary thing. It grounds it in their locality, and so they understand it. So I entirely am supportive of the thrust of this argument. But nature leaves out the built environment. And all of us live in flats or houses which are built. And in this country, some of them are in a rotten state of, they leak energy, they need adaptation.
Yeah.
They don't need all to be pulled down and flattened and bulldozed with horrible new buildings. They need to be cherished and adapted to the climate.
So what's your question to the panel?
So my question is, do you agree that you should take out the word "the" and have "a"?
And have it as an NA, okay.
A built environment.
Yeah. So there's more than nature that could unlock this. Okay, got you. Up at the back.
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much for all the speakers. Nick Pigeon from Cardiff University. It's a challenge to Baroness Coffey, but I'd like all the speakers to have a think about this. What is Plan B? Because it's clear that scrapping the Climate Change Act would completely fracture the consensus. So given the question at the conference here, we can't allow that. If we can't allow that, but we also want to meet some of the concerns on the less radical side, which is saying this is going to be too expensive to meet the 2050 target, what is the Plan B? Can the panelists have a little think about that? Thank you.
Thank you. And then there was one right down here, sorry. Oh no, here, yeah.
Hi, I'm Tess Colley, a journalist at Ends Report. Tony, I know you said your views on the planning bill must remain a secret, but I think it's a fair question that you're talking about nature recovery and how that's different to conservation.
Yeah.
Overall, do you think the planning bill as it is currently stands, will that help or hinder that goal that Natural England has set out to achieve, which is to halt the decline of species in the next few years? And more generally, we were talking about storytelling and the climate story this morning at the conference. This is more generally to the panel, but there's been a lot of talk about, from the top of government, nature's a blocker. The story there is that, kill the newts. How, if we're talking about, can we build a kind of a consensus around nature? What sort of impact has that message had on any ambition to do that?
Okay, great. 3 good questions there. I'm going to start with that last one, and you, Tony.
So the bit for me was on the planning bill, wasn't it?
Yeah, Tony,
Yeah.
planning bill. Is it going to get us to the Environment Act?
Yeah, exactly. And so you link it to the targets that government has that Thérèse mentioned in terms of the 2021 Environment Act goal to halt the decline in the abundance of species, plus there's a whole load more in the Environmental Improvement Plan. And so what we need to do is map out delivery pathways between where we are and achieving those goals. And we will have multiple routes for doing this. So some of them will be via agriculture, and this is possibly the biggest thing, is in terms of how we use those resources to encourage land managers to be able to bring biodiversity back into the landscape. There's going to be a component using existing approaches, including national nature reserves, for example, of which we're just declaring a significant new number. And then also through how we manage built development and infrastructure, which is the subject of the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. And our advice to government there has been to highlight the opportunity that we've got to go from a site-by-site approach and species-by-species approach into a more strategic space whereby we can look at the whole landscape and achieve nature recovery at scale in a way which is linked to the built development that is being approved. And so we have some good experiences of having done this over the last few decades, including around the heathlands of south and west of London and the Thames Basin heaths, where there has been very significant housing pressure now for a long time, which would have posed a significant threat to the populations of birds protected in SPAs there, namely nightjar, Dartford warbler, woodlark, and the threat would have come from people walking dogs in particular in tens of thousands of new houses crowded around the edge of those protected areas. We raised a flag on that 2 decades ago and said this is a problem, and got into a conversation with developers and local government and central government about how we could manage that pressure to draw it away from the core protected areas to create more green space for people to enjoy, and at the same time as safeguarding those birds. As a result of that, and this is the definition of a strategic solution, looking at the entire landscape around the protected area as well as the protected area itself. What we have finished up doing there is building 30,000 houses at the same time as increasing the population of nightjar, woodlark and Dartford warbler, at the same time as creating amazing places where people walk their dogs that have a lot of birds and other wildlife, but not those that are protected under international law. And so our advice to government has been to find ways in which we can codify that kind of approach to make it normal rather than the exception, which is what was going on before with our Natural England officers working at ground level, trying to broker those kinds of deals effectively in a way that could unlock the housing whilst bringing a nature recovery benefit. And so the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, for us, we have seen as an opportunity to create more of that kind of thinking, including in relation to nutrient pollution, which has been a very hot subject during recent times. We have been developing what we regard as strategic solutions to that, but they've been quite limited by the current legal regime, which is site by site, species by species, house by house. What we think we need to be doing is looking more broadly, in some cases at entire catchments, and working out the amount of compensation needed to accommodate house building, which is going to take place over years, rather than doing it with every individual development, frustrating the developers, clogging up the planning system, and not necessarily delivering very good outcomes for nature either. So that's the thinking that we've fed into that. It's not our job to now debate that or to consider amendments or for it to, be sent through the parliamentary process. We don't engage with that. We advise. That has been the basis of our advice, and now the politicians decide on what they would like to do with that.
Good answer.
Thank you. Well, also true.
I'm going to come back to the question that David at you,
Sure.
Thérèse, which was about what is Plan B.
Well, I'll try and take in both the questions. So, is nature or ACCI?
Yeah.
So, it's Margaret Thatcher kicked this off in '85 about ozone layer, climate, all the rest of it, big speeches. So, and we have reduced emissions extraordinarily in this country. We're just reaching a particular challenge. And the reason I'm slightly diverting, but we'll come back to answer your question, is that I was faced with an average £2.6 billion budget for farming, this transition as we were moving, which has been accelerated in reducing the basic payment equivalent. But I was challenging my own officials to say, right, we've got our carbon budgets to hit, and I'm not going to do it the way that DESNZ wants us to do it, which was to basically have no outdoor cattle, because that was the way to contain methane, according to DESNZ, and it's just like, we're not doing that. And we weren't going to go on a campaign of reducing meat eating. So that just wasn't within our DNA. But that was a case then of trying to, how do you get the best of both worlds? And the answer is you can't always. Sometimes you just have to do things for carbon and climate. Sometimes you have to do things just for nature. It's rare that you have that 100 versus zero gain. You have to try and find that sweeter spot in a way that is accessible. And this is the key in terms of Plan B, of how do we bring and make sure that instead of under the old regime of agricultural funding, where half the money went, just under half the money went to 10% of the landowners and farmers, how we flip that so that we get many more people involved right across the country, accessing that financing to address the situation that you had earlier. Treasury still doesn't get this. They still really do not understand this and, in fact, resent the money going to the farming industry and landowners more broadly and other NGOs who are able to access it. So for me, the Plan B is trying to find a constructive way forward with the Conservatives, which will still see reductions in emissions. But I think that undoubtedly Kemi wants to do more on nature, but we have to make it as straightforward as possible for as many people as possible to get involved. So that's my Plan B of how you let 1,000 flowers bloom, or whatever the cliche is. And that is why trying to identify the consensus of the gentleman in the middle row is challenging. I mean, fundamentally, Labour is only interested in climate change. They're not that interested as much in nature. If they were, they wouldn't be trying to complain about everything being stopped, when actually a lot of this is in the competence of the likes of HS2 Limited and other organisations and other developers. Certain developers are fantastic, others are just keen to do as little as possible in order to meet whatever BNG targets they have, and then try and say, actually, we can't afford them anyway, so please get rid of them. So I'm afraid there will continue to be an unhealthy challenge in trying to get both right. At the moment, there's no doubt climate is winning. For many people in this room, that'll be a great thing. For me, nature, where it once I thought it was no longer Cinderella. In fact, I stood up at a conference a couple of years ago, talked about how nature was the new Barbie and climate was the Ken. But now it's the other way around. So, but we've got to get going again and really crack on with nature. And that's why I'm afraid for consensus, it will be a key, but it should be the key in my view.
Maya?
I had a bit just to the kind of question of whether the government influences how we think about nature, just because I think it's really interesting, because a lot of people I talk to literally couldn't really tell you what climate change is, couldn't define biodiversity, and think of the environment as something you worry about when you've got nothing else to worry about, basically. Especially at the moment with kind of all of the economic issues that people are struggling with. They don't care about what's going on in 25 years' time because they don't even know where they're going to be next month. But I think a lot of that actually comes from the way that politically we've communicated about environmental issues, and scientifically as well, obviously. I think historically having made both biodiversity loss and climate change kind of very statistical issues rather than personal ones, I think has made a big difference. But I also wanted to comment, because I actually had a skim through what Reform has said about the environment, which I think is important, because they have nearly 30% of the vote at the moment, according to YouGov. And I found it very interesting because it wasn't completely anti-environment. They're talking a bit about, again, I do not back Reform, but they're talking about things like tree planting, for example, which I found very interesting, because I think it basically felt like how nature can be connected to these very traditional English values, restoring what once was, etc., versus they refer to net zero as crippling the economy, which obviously is factually incorrect, and cutting back on obviously most of our kind of wider green policy. And I found that in particular very interesting, because it kind of allows a space for people to engage with nature and with the environment, but not in a way that's systemic. And I think that's a lot of the issues at the moment, even when having these conversations about the environment, is kind of we need more trees, this is a lovely forest, we want to protect it, and less kind of acknowledgement of the way that nature ties in, obviously, to climate change mitigation and adaptation, and also how it's kind of necessary in a wider sense, such as bogs. Environmentalists love talking about how important bogs are, and no one else does. But yeah, I think it's just very interesting to look at it from that perspective.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up the point about the rhetoric coming from the government on bats and newts, and I think that's not the only way that we hear them talking about nature. I think we're obviously hearing that around some aspects of planning, but elsewhere there are more positive references. I think in terms of, can you care about climate change and does that mean you care about nature, I think we're at a point in reducing emissions in line with net zero now where the energy system has decarbonised a lot, and the food system is going to emerge as the largest single remaining source of emissions at some point in the 2030s. And so nature is brought more centrally into the climate change conversation by that fact, I think. But I think it's interesting how nature generally polls well amongst people, yet we still see that rhetoric at times, which I think just says people care about having houses to live in, and so the government will use nature when it makes sense to in terms of that argument. But what does that mean? I think this whole point about is nature key to the environmental consensus raises the question of what do people think of as nature, and is it the same as what environmentalists think of nature? And sometimes we slip into talking about technical things or things that aren't relating it to how people experience nature. We know that at their heart people care about the green spaces around them, but it does go further than that. It's not just about the park down the end of the road, because we know that people really care about deforestation, and people get really emotionally affected by things like the orangutans and what's happening, and palm oil became this massive thing because of the images that were around it. So I think there's this whole unexploited thing there, I think, of where people do have this concern about nature, but we often maybe miss it a bit in how we then talk about the policies that we need to restore nature, because like you said, just having more nature will help people to access more of it, but it needs to be talked about in those terms and linked together better, potentially, to best make the use of that link.
So I think it is a key, not the key, but it's a pretty important one from what you're saying, and that we could make more of it, basically. Yeah. Any more questions from people? Yes. Oh, loads. Great. 2 here and 1 over here.
Hiya, Amy from Greenpeace. I'm just interested in like the distinctions that's often made between climate, nature, environment. It's all the same thing. We're talking about the same thing. And the more, like the point you just made, the more we move into like looking at where emissions are coming from, it's kind of land-based. It's, you know, we're looking at nature-based solutions. It's all the same thing. So this sort of separation, you know, is it being driven by politics? Is it helpful? How can we stop it if that's what we need to do?
Okay. Yeah, Ruth as well, yeah.
Thanks, Ruth Chambers from Green Alliance. Really love the panel discussion. My question is for all of the panel members, and you, Becky, if you'd like to answer. It's been a really difficult year for nature, I think. You know, we hear constantly negative talk about blockers, about difficulties, about failures, changing goalposts. What is your message of hope for nature recovery that we can take away with us?
Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much. It's Rachel from the Aldersgate Group. I'm also a trustee at Rewilding Britain. I want to take it back to the question. It sounds like there's pretty violent consensus in the room that, yes, nature is a key to rebuilding environmental consensus. The question is, for anybody who is interested, builds a bit on Mya-Rose's point about people understanding any of this. I'd also like to shout out the RSPB TikTok channel, which I love so much. If anybody here has never seen Bird of the Week, it is the best. I'm not even on TikTok. I can see it on...
I don't understand it, but apparently it's great.
Well, this is the thing. So the question is really about who does what next. If we want to... and then also, everyone's used the word we a lot in this conversation. Who even is we? Who needs to do what next to bring nature into the conversation to help to recreate this consensus?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, very good.
Right. So our first question was about this point about separation from Amy. You know, and is that being driven by the politics? Is it being driven by us? It's all the same stuff, right? So, you know, how do we stop that separation happening? Who wants to come in on that? Do you want to come in on that, Thérèse?
Well, I don't think they are the same. There's an interdependency, not disputing that otherwise. And by the way, I actually think more people far more understand climate change generally than they do about nature. So, and a lot of nature focuses on the wonderful, beautiful species, the fauna. Whether that's the big ones abroad or whether it's the smaller, cute red squirrels that people know is under threat. What is less known or understood is why it matters about, is it the lady's slipper? You know, the flora side of life, why that matters. Why does it matter about a particular snail that Rachel Reeves talked about recently? So these are I think that is more difficult to explain on why the amount of work that UK taxpayers have funded abroad, the eradication of mice from Gough Island. Gough Island isn't inhabited, so who gives the stuff? So it is quite difficult to explain some of these challenges when, in contrast, I think people have got about climate change that it is going to impact their way of life. It is leading to more dramatic weather events and so on. So I'm afraid I disagree with you on that. They still love nature, and but there's a wider sense, I think, of they understand why we need to make changes because of the issues to do with climate change. But coming back to being hopeful, I am hopeful that we will get local nature recovery strategies in place. I'd be delighted if we got a bit of funding to help them get on with it and really make a difference in aspects of our planning system, but in other regards. Obviously, the CBD negotiations is a difficult moment, but nevertheless, we have to try and take what we can. I don't know quite what's happening with the land use framework. I wouldn't over-rely on that, candidly. But the people are interested. They are keen. It's no secret that the UK has the highest proportion of members of the public who belong to an environmental organisation, so they care. And I think we just need to, again, come back to make it as easy as possible for people to do the right thing. And that is where both regulators, delivery partners and government need to genuinely look at what is holding back when actually there's a genuine desire for the majority of people in this country to try and get nature recovering. That's why the Environment Act was so popular. I am concerned, though, that we're getting stuck and finding excuses which we will regret in a few years' time.
Tony, do you want to just come in on that and also answer that question about who does what next?
Yeah, so this whole point about framing, I think, is absolutely critical. For all of us sitting in here, this is day-to-day kind of, language, climate change, nature, biodiversity, environment. Most people, I think they're slightly confused by it. And also, I think the word environment in particular is really problematic because it has become associated with things going on somewhere else rather than directly linked to all of us. And I've been thinking a little bit about this lately, and I do wonder if we might wish to explore some other frames of reference as a community of environmentally kind of conscious people to try and galvanise action in a more kind of meaningful way. So one phrase I've been thinking about, which I think sums it up, is to, instead of talk about environment, to talk about our life support system. Got a slightly different connotation. If you say people environment, I've noticed in rooms of members of the general public, if you talk about life support system, people suddenly look a little bit troubled because that sounds quite serious compared with environment, which might be equated with washing a yogurt pot and putting it in the bin, whereas life support system sounds a little bit more kind of fundamental and significant. And then translating that into things, okay, what do we need to do to protect our life support system? Well, we need to restore the health of wildlife and nature, we need to consume resources more efficiently, and we need to reduce pollution. And I think that there may be an improvement we could make in how we frame all of this through interrogating some of those ideas. And I don't know if Green Alliance would have the bandwidth or the time to go and do some work on this. I see Sean sitting there. Sean, can we find out if environment works? Get some advertising people in and just look at the frames of reference and the way in which this is communicated. Because I'm increasingly feeling that there are some quite fundamental communications challenges that probably we should have a look at. And I don't know what the answer would be.
We know biodiversity doesn't work, which is why we talk about nature.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Nature works, biodiversity doesn't.
So you've given Green Alliance a job, but who else does
Yeah, I'm coming to that. And actually on biodiversity, the BBC did a Vox Pop survey in the street years ago. They went out and said to members of the public, what is biodiversity? The single most popular answer was a washing powder, which tells us that we have some serious work to do in thinking through how we're going to get this across to people. In terms of who needs to do what,
quickly,
and on the kind of on the hope, there's so much going on at ground level, and the political narrative, the top level narrative, is it growth or is it nature? It's good, it goes up and down, but the thing that really matters is what's going on at ground level, and there is a ton of work amongst farming communities, the NGOs doing fantastic work, community groups getting stuck in. And actually, in terms of what needs to happen next, I was very struck by a colleague coming back to Cambridge from Africa a couple of years ago. We were sitting having a cup of coffee, and she said, I find that in this country, everyone expects the government to sort out ecological issues. In Africa, where I've just been, it's all about the community doing it for themselves. And we were talking about a local river in Cambridge, which is full of shopping trolleys and a bit rubbish, and like, you know, what should the Environment Agency do? And we just got discussing, well, why don't we get a group of residents just to sort that place out? And I think if we could find ways of fostering more of that involvement of the public in doing the conservation work themselves,
in their community,
you get ownership of the outcomes, you get protection of the place de facto, because people value it, you get health and well-being benefits, and you get the environmental outcomes you want. And I don't think it would necessarily be a very difficult business model to explore in terms of how we could set off that kind of community action across the country. So I think that's what I would do next, based upon the optimism coming from action rather than talk.
I'm going to take that as your message of hope, and I'm just going to come to Maya and Lydia to give up me your message of hope as well, which Ruth requested.
Sure, always for Ruth. Well, I mean, putting aside the RSPB's TikTok channel, which I think everyone should have a look at, it's exceptional. I think my message of hope is in the particular. I know that the general trends RSPB show still going in the wrong direction, but they're in terms of wildlife decline. But there are really hopeful stories of individual species that have recovered really well and really quickly after being reintroduced into the UK or as a result of habitat restoration. So beavers doing incredibly well compared to where they were, storks now breeding in the UK, kites are just absolutely everywhere, having not been here. So I think there is opportunity for nature to bounce back quickly if the right conditions can be put in place, and we should take some hope from that.
Great, thank you. Mya-Rose.
No, I was going to answer the last question. I won't do that to you. I was actually going to mention beavers as well, just because I think both in terms of the ability of a population to bounce back, but actually the acceptance from people in the countryside allowing and I think beavers in particular, because you can't control them. And I think the fact that even there are farmers who are willing to have beavers on their land is such a big shift, especially because it's, you know, in the UK, obviously, it's this constant narrative of farmers versus nature. So I find that very exciting. But I think also my work with Black to Nature keeps me hopeful, because it's this constant cycle of taking kids and teenagers and adults sometimes outside and helping them fall in love with nature and seeing that galvanize them in terms of environmental action. And so in a very individual level, I can kind of see how people can shift very quickly over a period of days, and that kind of gives me hope for the future and hope in terms of engaging the wider public with whatever you want to call it, environmental issues, biodiversity loss, all that good stuff. Yeah.
I am going to answer it, Ruth, as well, just quickly. So I talked about it being a gateway drug. So 2 things you can go away and inject yourself with if you want to feel hope. One is go to Groundswell. So Groundswell is a fantastic celebration, really, of regenerative farming and the way in which nature-friendly farming is just coming forward as this kind of surge. So I do worry about momentum in that shift in farming. But the thing that makes me worry less about it is to go to something like Groundswell. That will give you a real boost around the role that farming can play. The second thing I'd tell you to do is to go and watch on YouTube. There's a fantastic film that I have to say RSPB has made called Return, which is about the white-tailed eagle and the return of the white-tailed eagle to our skies, even above London, in the last 50 years. And it's an amazingly inspiring story. So go and watch that, and you can see how, exactly as you were saying, nature can come back really powerfully. And I hope this conversation, and I must thank the panel who've done so well, has absolutely shown that nature is a key to rebuilding environmental consensus, and we should be making much more of it and pushing much harder at that door, because I think that is the thing that will absolutely bring people, and therefore the political consensus, with us. Thank you.
Thank you.